Welcome to the Liberal Democrat Leadership Hustings for the Northern Liberal Network and the Liberal Democrats podcast. I'm Jim Hancock. I used to be the political editor, first of all, of Granada TV, and then more recently the BBC in the Northwest. Our first interview this afternoon is with the Deputy Leader of the party, Ed Davey. Mr. Davey, thank you for doing this. You were well beaten by Joe Swinson last year. Why do you think the Liberal Democrats have changed their minds about your ability to lead the party?
Well, I got a lot of support, and many people thought it was a close-run thing in terms of where they put their ballots. And Joe inspired them. No doubt, a young female leader was very attractive, and she's a great friend of mine. And it was a pleasure to work with her. But time has moved on, and I think the party's in quite a challenging position, as is the country. And I think people will be looking for a leader who's, yes, got the vision, and I'm talking about a greener, fairer, more caring society as the vision for the Liberal Democrats. But I think they're also looking for a leader who's got that experience, who has shown that he or she can win elections, election after election. I fought 7 and won 6, and I've been part of winning teams. And given the challenges facing the party, we need to get back to winning to show we can be relevant, so our policies and visions can be put into practice.
Liberal Democrat leaders chronically do not get national media exposure very much before a general election. And one way around that people like Paddy Ashdown achieved was to be a bit sparky, to gather attention, to be a big personality. You seem a steady sort of guy. Have you got what it takes to sort of raise your game enough to attract attention?
Well, on Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, I managed to clean bowl the Prime Minister. He wasn't expecting my question, and I got an answer that I don't think he wanted to give, namely a commitment to an independent inquiry on the coronavirus and his handling of it. On TV, that got huge coverage. Radio got huge coverage. The video of me asking that question, getting that answer, and winning that for the Liberal Democrats got over 1 million views, which is almost unheard of. So, just this week, I've shown that I can cut through and make a real big difference for Liberal Democrats. And I did that on the Dominic Cummings issue, where I was wall-to-wall coverage for 72 hours. So you're right, you have to take your opportunities. I've shown I do.
I mean, are you comfortable doing this? Do you regard this as part of the political landscape now, that you've got to try and be a bit colourful, be a bit controversial? Or are you basically a serious, dull sort of policy guy?
No, of course you've got to get the media coverage in any way you can. But I tell you one thing, and I think it's more experience than anything else. You need to have message discipline. What has really alarmed me in recent years is we've not shown that media discipline. We've talked to ourselves, and we've taken issues up that aren't relevant for very many of the voters. And I think people have lost touch with where we are. I mean, the general election review for the Liberal Democrats, one of its probably starkest findings was that people didn't know what we stand for anymore or who we were. And that's a real failure. We have got to make sure that when people go into that ballot booth, they know exactly who the Liberal Democrats are and what we stand for. And that requires using really strong, tough message discipline. So, when professional journalists like yourselves ask us the questions you want to, we bring it back to the Liberal Democrat story of a greener, fairer, more caring society. You see, I'm doing it already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to come on to the Thornhill review in a moment. But I just want to ask you about the coalition. I mean, Joe Swinson, perhaps surprisingly, was attacked very frequently, particularly by Labour, for being part of the coalition, part of austerity. How much do you think that will still hang around your neck in the next 2 or 3 years, that you were a member of that coalition?
Well, if you look at the general election review, I'm sorry, I'm coming back to that, but in the 61 pages and the many recommendations for the party, coalition hardly gets a mention. Indeed, the challenges facing the party go far deeper and are far many than what happened in the coalition. And by the time we get to 2024, when the voters will be thinking about post-COVID, post-Brexit, post-years of Johnson Tory government, I think that question will not come up. And to the extent that it does, I mean, I'm happy to take the question on. I'll talk about my personal record. where as the Cabinet Minister for Climate Change, I nearly quadrupled renewable power. I had to fight George Osborne. I had to fight people like Eric Pickles, and I fought them and I won in government. And that's why we're the world leader in offshore wind. Take Hull, I managed to persuade Siemens to invest over £300 million there with ABP Ports to produce a manufacturing facility, creating 1,000 jobs, building offshore wind turbine blades for the wind farms in the North Sea, green jobs. And because of that experience, I've got credibility, and I can show that the Liberal Democrat message of a greener economy, where we tackle the jobs crisis and the awful recession and the climate change together, bring them together, that can be done because I've done it. It's not just a pipe dream. I've got the experience of actually delivering it.
Before you polish your green credentials too much, on the question of fracking, which, as you know, has been highly controversial in the north of England, as Energy Secretary, you said it wasn't evil, it could bring jobs, tax revenue, and greater energy security. Have you changed your mind on that?
Well, I was in a coalition with the Tories with the requirement to ensure that some of their policies were heard about. But I was also a politician, and I passed a regulation to stop fracking when there were earthquakes, the seismicity regulation. And that regulation has stopped fracking in our country. So yes, I had to play the game while I was quadrupling renewables. I had to talk about the Tories' obsession with fracking. But what did I do? And I think people should be judged by what they do and their outcomes. We've got the renewable energy, coal's coming off the grid, and no fracking has happened because of the regulation that I passed. So there's no other politician in our country who's done more to stop fracking. So I managed to do what's called the art of the possible in politics. And I think that shows some judgment and some experience.
Let's come on to the Thornhill review on the 2019 general election. And I must say, as an outsider, I think it shows commendable honesty that the party has really, washed its linen in public on this. But you were the deputy leader when decisions were taken on some of the key issues to allow the 2019 general election, to campaign for revoke, to present Joe as the Prime Minister in waiting. And those decisions are described as either reckless or wrong by the Thornhill Review. I mean, how much responsibility do you take for all that?
Well, let's remember, I lost the leadership election to Jo. We fought the election in a very friendly way. She made me her deputy leader, and I was loyal throughout that period, and I'm loyal to her achievements now. But that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that she decided, nor does it mean that I was agreeing in private. But I think it's unfair to blame Jo for everything. It's one of the reasons why, when I was helping co-commission the General Election Review's remit, I ensured we went back not just in 2019, but also 2017 to 2015. Because some of us who've been around quite a while, I've been a party member for 30 years, an MP for 20 years, know that some of the Liberal Democrats' problems are quite deep-seated. And we need to not oversimplify that it was about revoke or about the coalition. If you get the wrong diagnosis, you won't cure the problem. And what I think is so strong about the Thornhill Review is, yes, it says that some of the judgments made in the run-up to 2019 election were wrong. They were. And some of us were making that argument at the time in private. But that is not the challenge that the party faces. It goes deeper than that. And one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about the party's future, actually, is that we've got the Thornhill Review. I want to use it as a mandate to get reform of the party, so we get back to winning ways. So we're winning councils across the country, that we can be relevant in national politics and win those seats across the north and across the south.
So you're slightly painting a picture which does seem to be in the Thornhill analysis, that even as deputy leader, you couldn't change a very tightly knit group around Jo, who were more or less loyal to themselves, not paying much attention to the federal party, not paying much attention to the president, not paying much attention to the party activists. It was almost a very tightly knit sort of group of people to which you weren't even influential.
Well, I wasn't in the close team, no.
You got the support of the establishment of the party. That's what commentators say in this leadership election. Most of them seem to have their confidence in you. But given the analysis of the Thornhill Review, is that going to be a liability to you compared to the sort of the freshness that Layla Moran brings to the contest?
I love the notion that there's an establishment in the Liberal Democrats. We're an anti-establishment party. All these so-called establishment figures have been fighting elections for the party, often not winning them, and still coming back for more. What I've actually got are people who are campaigners, who are winners, and people who know how to win. And it's those campaigners and winners who are backing me, the people who have been there and won. And I'm delighted to get the backing of people like Daisy Cooper and Tim Farron and Munira Wilson and Sarah Olney and Christine Jardine from the Commons, but also 13 out of our 16 MEPs. And it's quite difficult to say that those MEPs were establishment. They only got elected briefly in 2019, but they're all, well, 13 out of 16 are backing me because they see me not just as a very pro-European leadership candidate, but also someone who knows how to win. And that's on the back of the Thornhill Review is what is needed. And winning isn't just about some quick fix solution here, some exciting interview there. It's actually about long-term hard graft, bringing a vision of a greener, fairer, more caring society, but pursuing that with real experience of how to cut through on the media, as I showed last week with the win on the independent inquiry into COVID, but also on showing how to cut through in campaigning, because we will really cut through when we start winning in elections.
I'm sure you'll agree that some of the hardest graft is going to be in the north of England, and I want to spend some time now on this because of the particular audience that we're talking to. I mean, 10 years ago, Liberal Democrats controlled councils in the north, like Liverpool and Sheffield, had MPs in places like Hallam, Rochdale, Southport. Now it's the parties, certainly in terms of MPs, is broadly speaking the South East and Scotland. How are you going to rebuild in the north? What are you going to say to the north? What will your leadership, how will you go about addressing the poor state of the Liberal Democrats in the north of England?
I start with the voters and the voters' concerns and make sure we understand what they are, whether they're in Liverpool or Newcastle, Hull or Sheffield, across the north, and make sure that we are addressing those concerns and showing why Liberal Democrats have an answer to those concerns. So when I talk about a greener, fairer, more caring society, I'm talking to people and communities across the north, because unemployment and job losses are going to hit many, many communities, and they're going to want to know what the Liberal Democrat response is. And my response is, look, if we invest in the economy of the future, not only can we give our young people jobs now and training and opportunities, but we can also prepare them and the economy for the future. So I've been very strong on a massive green recovery plan in green homes, green transport, green power. And that backs up my experience when I was a cabinet minister. I got jobs in the green economy across the north. I've talked about the jobs in Hull, but there were jobs all over, because the great thing about the renewable revolution, which I spearheaded, is it does provide jobs in the regions and nations of our country, not just in London and the southeast. So I think that's a powerful message. I think there's another powerful message on social justice. The idea that Labour has a monopoly on social justice is a joke. Liberal Democrats, when we had the chance, managed to put in place the most progressive education policy since the Second World War. It's called the pupil premium. Which education spokesperson of the party to develop that? I did. And we put it into power, and it's getting more money to disadvantaged kids, more money than Labour ever did. So let's take Labour on the fairness agenda, and let's also take them on the caring health agenda. Labour like to say they've got a monopoly of the NHS, even though Liberals were very much involved in the thinking behind its creation. But the real issue for NHS at the moment is the care sector, is social care. COVID has shown that. Johnson said, let's protect the NHS. Well, fine, but he forgot the care homes. And look at the tragedy that happened there. Liberal Democrats in local government, in national government, have argued about integrating NHS and social care. If only that had happened, maybe fewer people will have died. And the point is going forward, let me tell you this, finish one point. The point on this is that if we're the party of care, the party of carers, I think we can take Labour on and we can win voters that they've previously taken for granted.
Okay, I particularly want to tailor these answers to the North. I mean, not only have you got Labour now in the North, you've also got Boris Johnson, interestingly, with, you know, having broken down the Red Wall and talking about levelling up in the North. How much of a problem is that for you? How are you going to compete with that agenda if and when it gets underway?
Well, I think when things are done correctly, we can support them. But I don't think he has the vision or the ambition that's going to really deliver. I mean, just look at the summer statement. They had this stamp duty cut. Now, the biggest beneficiaries are going to be London and the South East for that. Why wasn't he investing in housing across the country, which would have really reached out to the regions and really would have leveled up? You know, let's be honest, a leopard doesn't change his spots. Boris Johnson was interested in the votes of the North East, not the voters. And Liberal Democrats, as community politicians across the North, I think are the ones who can really have a message of hope, really have a message which resonates with northern communities. We still are the opposition to Labour in many places. And while clearly we can win more seats off the Tories at the next general election, I want us to take on lazy, inefficient Labour councils, ineffective Labour MPs, wherever they are in the North, with a real message that we have an agenda that's radical, that is about sorting out their housing, sorting out their schooling, making sure that the NHS and care sector works for them and doesn't ever let happen what's happened before under both Labour and Tory governments, where they get forgotten.
Can I just ask one or two questions about the delivery mechanisms for regional policy? I mean, it was striking to me that almost as soon as you came into office, although Vince Cable had some reservations, the Liberal Democrats, as part of the coalition, were prepared to abolish the regional development agencies, abolish the government offices in the regions, and the unelected assemblies. You swept away all the regional structures. I wonder why you did that, but more importantly, I suppose, to the future. I mean, do you have a regional policy in relation to the delivery mechanisms for greater prosperity in the North?
Well, let's also remember we had the Regional Growth Fund, where we managed to fund a whole set of startups, of new businesses, of established businesses, and get money straight to them. And that made a big difference for business and for jobs in many communities across the North. And that was a Vince Cable Liberal Democrat initiative. And I wanted to go further. You know, we created the business bank because we couldn't trust some of the private banks were just not lending, particularly to northern businesses. And we argued at the last election, it was one of the things I was very keen on, was that the British Business Bank should have regional offices and a regional dimension. So the state-owned bank, if you like, is there in the regions in the way that you often see in places like Germany, where there's a real partnership between those state finances and the businesses and local authorities in those areas. And, you know, bringing into that a total Liberal Democrat commitment of devolving power. You know, we do want to devolve power. A lot of the ones that you talked about were quangos. We want to devolve power in a way that's democratic, that really gives power to a much stronger local democracy with real powers, and yes, a regional identity as well.
Can I ask you about elected mayors? And this is quite a hot topic in Lancashire at the moment, where the government favour the whole of Lancashire having a combined, well, maybe 3 combined authorities, but having an elected mayor for Lancashire. What is your view about elected mayors for the cities and for the wider, more rural areas of the north?
I've always been more sceptical about mayors. I think it places too much power in the hands of one person, and we need to be very cautious about that. Having said that, I do want to make sure we have far stronger local and regional government. And the Liberal Democrats need to really engage with our local government family across the country, not just in the north, but to make sure that when we have our hugely ambitious powers of devolving power and money, by the way, and money, we do that in a way which is genuinely democratic. And I just worry that sometimes the mayor model isn't as democratic as I'd like to see, because between elections, there's very few accountability mechanisms. And that's where mayors can go very badly wrong.
What about the meeting powerhouse? I mean, it was very much George Osborne's baby. Theresa May less so. Are the Liberal Democrats believers in that?
Well, we certainly want a northern powerhouse to get jobs across the north. And that means a commitment that actually is delivered upon. The problem with George Osborne is he talked a good game and failed. I can point to my record, and my northern powerhouse was getting renewable industry across the north. And I would want to build on that. But I'd also like, by the way, to get behind some of the really important transport links. The east-west, west-east railway is absolutely crucial. I think it should go from Leeds through to Manchester, to Sheffield, through to Hull, and of course starting at Liverpool. So we really connect east and west, and I think that would deliver on the northern powerhouse. But I'm afraid
more than HS2.
Oh, much more.
I mean, would you like to see HS2 scrapped?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of the reasons I'm keen on railway investment is we've got a very congested railway system. And if we also want to reduce the domestic flights that happen, and give people genuine alternatives, the best way is to have a railway system that is faster, more efficient, and has more capacity. So I think it's not just either or, it's and.
Just turning to one or two sort of national perspectives as we draw our interview to a conclusion. Under your leadership, would the Liberal Democrats be campaigning to return to the European Union in the 2024 manifesto?
We will be the most pro-European party because we are. We are the voice of those pro-Europeans, and we will want to make the case for close relationship with the European Union, for cooperation, whether it's on trade and jobs, whether it's on the climate, whether it's on things like the pandemic. You know, that cooperation is in the interests of everybody. And my heart won't have left the European Union. But I think the Liberal Democrats have to enter the next election with our heads. Yes, we have to be principled and pro-European and be really clear that we have not given up our European ideals. We're an internationalist party. But I think if the next election we made rejoin a central proposition, I think the voters would think we were tin-eared and weren't listening to them. And I think it would be worse than revoke. And I said at the last leadership election that we ought to reach out to Leave voters and Leave communities, because I felt that it was bad politics to turn your back on 50% of the electorate. But also I wanted to represent people who might not agree with us on Europe, but might agree with us on social justice, on housing, on education, on the NHS. And I stand by what I said back then. I want to make sure that when I'm leading the party, we speak to voters and give them a reason for voting for us, not turning them off us. That's crucial. And it would be one of the ways we would rebuild across the north. Because let's face it, large parts of the north did vote Leave. They've lost a lot of trust in us because of that. And we've got to build that back. And the best way to do that is to listen to them and tell them the Liberal Democrat solutions to their daily life problems.
If you look not just around Britain, but around the world, these are difficult times for Liberal Democrats. Resurgent populism, nationalism. Polly Mackenzie, who I know you know, an aide to the previous leader, said on Radio 4 recently that realistically, the Liberal Democrats should try and be an organisation of ideas to put them forward into the sort of political domain. But the idea of, that they're going to form a government is just unrealistic. Would you settle for that sort of role, being a sort of vigorous sort of think tank rather than pretending that you're going to get back to power?
I'm not in politics to be a think tank. I'm in politics to get into power and to put our policies and values into power. We do that all the time at local government. When Liberal Democrats take charge of a council, you see a difference. You do see a greener council. You do see a council that cares for the more vulnerable people. You do see councils that are more open and democratic. And so we are exercising power. So I reject what policy says immediately. But as for national government, I still think we can get back into power. I've made it clear that there'll not be a coalition with the Tories under me or any understanding of the Tories. They are right-wing, they are nationalist, they are illiberal, and we can have no truck with them. And I want to see what we can do with other progressive parties. It's very early days. And it will, anything that we do in Westminster in due course, whatever form that may or may not take, shouldn't stop us fighting Labour councils where they're rubbish and Labour MPs where they're ineffective. But I do think our cause will be best served if we get the Tories out of government.
Is Layla Moran too radical? Would she frighten the voters of Surbiton?
Listen, I'm not going to have a go at my friend and opponent, Layla Moran. She can speak for herself. She has said that she thinks there's a gap the other side of Keir Starmer. She said there's a Corbynista generation, I think were her phrase, and she edited a pamphlet which had some policies like that. But it's for her to decide precisely where she'd like to position the party. I'm very clear. I'm a centre-left progressive politician. I fought the Tories all my life. I've beaten the Tories all my life. I've beaten them in the constituency. I've beaten them in the council chamber. I've beaten them in government. And that track record of winning from a radical liberal perspective, from a centre-left progressive perspective, has meant I could appeal to those soft Tory voters, those pro-business people, those pro-European people who believe the Tory party has left them. And I think with that vision I have and the experience I have, I'm the best candidate to get that soft Tory vote and squeeze that Labour vote so we win many more seats.
Mr. Davey, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Well, we're now carrying on with the Liberal Democrat leadership hustings for the Northern Liberal Network and for the Liberal Democrat podcasts. And my guest now is Layla Moran. Layla, can I begin by asking you how you feel about the focus that there's been, not just in this campaign, but over the last 2 or 3 years, about personal issues surrounding you?
Yeah. Well, Jim, I found actually the process really interesting. I actually came to politics from outside the Westminster bubble. I was a teacher, I was a maths and physics teacher before. And, you know, you always see and hear these personal stories that come out about MPs. And actually, I decided that as I approached, you know, I was elected quite suddenly in 2017. I overturned a 10,000 Tory majority, and actually I'd lined up another job. I hadn't quite expected we'd do that all in one go and defeated the Tories in that way. And I decided I wanted to do politics differently, actually. And so one of the reasons why people know quite a lot about my private life is actually because I tell them. And from very early on, I spoke about, you know, my mental health issues, my battle with obesity, and I just don't shy away from it. So everyone knows who I am, and I think that builds trust. At a time in politics where you quite often get politicians who don't reveal these things, who don't talk about themselves. And what I found heartening, and particularly, you know, when I came out as a pansexual earlier this year, there was a newspaper that was actually threatening to do it on my behalf. And whilst I think most people can see that there is no public interest there, they pursued it. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to take control of that story and I'm going to turn it into a positive story. And I told my story. And off the back of it, I received so many lovely messages from people who, off the back of seeing my story, felt empowered and enabled to come out to their own families, because it sparked a conversation which they felt very unsure about having for themselves. So I embrace it.
I'm sure you'll accept my assurance that I'm not doing this out of any sense of prurience at all. It's just that we live in a big, bad world. And it just strikes me as an observer of the Liberal Democrats for many, many years that sometimes personal issues, and if you go back from Jeremy Thorpe, Charles Kennedy, Paddy even, Tim Farron, things of a personal nature or personal beliefs and so on have become enormously distracting for the party and have given your enemies a huge amount of ammunition. That's why I ask this and wonder whether, you know, this baggage that you've been very open with is a concern about whether you should be leader of the party.
I would say the opposite, Jim, because all the examples you've just given what's the one thing that they all have in common is that they were secret. And the issue isn't that people have private lives. I think most people can understand we're humans too. And actually, I would argue if we are going to present a different face to the party, if we are going to build back some trust and make people feel connected to you, they can understand that you're human too. But the problems come when politicians are asked about these things, especially if they're things that are quite negative, and they hide them, and they in some way, and people can sense that, I think. So I've taken the opposite approach.
I want to focus particularly on the north of England for the next few minutes, if I may. I mean, it's pretty grim, Layla, from some years ago, controlling councils like Liverpool and Sheffield and having MPs in Southport and Hallam and Rochdale. We really have taken a battering, and particularly in the last general election, we're more or less, apart from Tim Farron, wiped out in the north of England. So as the MP for Oxford and Abingdon, how do you begin to look at the task of being relevant in the north of England?
Well, first of all, Jim, I don't assume that I know. And the first thing that I did at that last election, and I have to tell you, I think like most Lib Dem members, just sick of waking up the day after a general election and feeling this sense of disappointment. It's been 10 years of decline now. We're at somewhere between 6 and 8% in the polls again. We barely moved. And we need to do something different. So despite my own result, which I was very pleased with, and we got the best ever result in this seat's history, I decided, actually, I'm going to go and ask the voters, and even recognizing we're a bubble within a bubble in this party. And where have we gone so wrong? So the first place I went actually was Leeds, and then I went to Sheffield. And what I asked those local parties to do was to take me door knocking so that I could have some quite in-depth conversations with voters on the doors about the party. And the questions I was asking was, what do you think of us? And what would make you vote for us again? Or for the first time, in fact. And the first thing that came back was that they haven't got a clue who we are. They could quite happily say that about Labour and the Tories. They were able to say, they've got a strong identity. But that bold liberal vision for the country, they have absolutely no idea what that is. And that's clearly where we need to start. We need to define what we are for. And if I was going to define success of my own leadership, it would be at the next election that question is answered in the minds of the electorate. But the second thing that they said was that they felt we were really out of touch and that we weren't talking about the issues they desperately cared about. So, among all these conversations, and I should say I didn't stop there. I went to Devon and Cornwall, I went to Wales, I went to Kent. I would have continued, except coronavirus, of course, took hold. And what came back was actually 3 broad areas, and this is what I based my campaign around, but we need to remain nimble. So I would argue this is what I've heard so far. And the first is around public services. People care deeply about public services, whether they're, Labour, classically Labour-facing voters, whether they're Tory-facing voters, they care about the NHS, they care about education. Now, I've got a teaching background, and it was music to my ears when they said, well, actually, there's a bit of a gap in the market here for a party of education, because they kind of felt that Labour had taken that health and social care space. And so that's why education is front and centre of my campaign. But the other 2 areas is the environment, and that actually has a lot of resonance, both in Labour-facing areas where they care deeply about green issues, and they've been at the forefront of XR and the Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Futures, but also it has resonance in rural areas, which are sometimes more likely to vote Tory, because we're talking about rewilding, animal rights, all of those kinds of things are encompassed in that part. And the third is about the economy. And, the economy, let's face it, isn't a sexy thing to talk about on the door. If you knock on someone's door and go, hello, let's have a conversation about inflation, that's not really it. What we need to really get across to people is that we want a society that works for them, that's fairer. And I was talking to people who, they've got a bouncing baby on one arm and they've got an elderly mum on the other. And what they want to know is, how do they do this whilst balancing 2 jobs? They're in a gig economy that isn't working for them. And they feel that, the government speaks about rising GDP, albeit we're in a different phase of that now, but their concerns aren't being taken into account. So what I've said is we need to actually rethink how we do our economy. We need to really make sure that it works for everybody. And absolutely, through coronavirus, there is now this opportunity, I think, to rebuild. And I'm really excited about that.
Your persona, if you'll forgive me, is sort of middle class. I mean, how are you going to identify with people? Because that's the problem for the Liberal Democrats, isn't it? That, you know, you've got clusters of seats in the South East, clusters of seats in Scotland, nothing much in between at the moment. The party hasn't identified very well over the years with the BAME community, for instance. So it's quite complicated. You've got a really uphill task, haven't you?
Yeah, we do. We do. And I think to underestimate the scale of this task and to suggest it can be tackled quickly is not right. I mean, I don't want to be a leader for a couple of years. We've had too much turnover of leaders as it is. I want to be a leader for the 5 to 10 year mark. And in order to make that breakthrough, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, we need to know who we are. And in a nutshell, you know, what's that elevator pitch of what is a Liberal Democrat these days? Well, it all comes back to freedom. You know, it's about freedom to the individual and freedom to communities to be able to enforce their own view of what good looks like. But in order to be free to do that, you've also got to be free from ignorance, poverty, and conformity. And that liberal, empowered citizen role, people don't really get that about this. It means very bottom up. And actually rebuilding at a local government level, I think, is some of the answer to this. In my own seat, we didn't win here by me rocking up and going, hello, everyone, please vote for me. That's not how it worked. We built by electing councillor after councillor after councillor, building a big, strong local team. We need to start winning councils again. And actually, I think that's what we really need to focus on in the North in particular, because that base is there. But what I was hearing from members of my own party is that they've been feeling very left behind by the central party. We have become far too London-centric. And just as my first instinct was to go out and hear the voters of the North, and that was the very first thing I did, we need to continue to listen to the parties in the North. The national brand is broken, and often they win seats despite the national brand. We need to fix that. And that's why I talk about those bread and butter issues, because that's the thread that goes through all of it. And I hope that come the next set of council elections, and we have a huge set of council elections next May, people will be proud to put the messaging that we're putting on our leaflets, putting through doors in a council estate in Newcastle, because it's going to be talking about the things that people really, really care about.
I want to come on to the Thornhill report and the diagnosis of what went wrong and the party structure in a moment, but just continuing with this northern regional theme for a moment and turning to your actual structures for delivery. I mean, at the beginning of the coalition government, the regional structures were all swept away. Vince Cable sort of wanted to keep 1 and 2, but Eric Pickles, the Tory, was very keen to sweep away the regional development agencies, the government offices in the regions, the albeit unelected assemblies. So that was done, and I don't know what you think about that, and whether you do have a sort of a regional policy as such.
Yeah, well, I think it's in our DNA as Lib Dems to want to decentralise rather than centralise more. And this was, you know, one of the tussles that we didn't quite win. But having said that, Vince Cable did, as you point out, make an argument for it. And I think COVID-19 is going to present the country with a great opportunity to start to rebalance our economy. And I think it's that levelling up agenda that Boris Johnson talks about, I think he's going to struggle to deliver unless he starts to do this. And I think there is a space for the Liberal Democrats to make the case for returning to a more decentralised model based on strong local government. Because the problem we have at the moment is that local government is totally hollowed out. You know, after years of cuts, lots of which happened, you know, from 2010 onwards, local government just doesn't have that resilience to be able to drive this. And I do think it needs to be a bottom-up approach. In the Build Back Better book that I pulled together actually just before this leadership contest was finally started, I commissioned a chapter from Vince where he talks about we need a new industrial strategy that is much more place-based and where local communities can really come together and work out what happens next. And COVID-19 is going to be really, really difficult. You know, we're going to be looking at potentially 10% or higher unemployment. I'm desperately worried that we're going to end up in a situation like in the 80s where we've got towns that end up being forgotten. And unless you have a nimble, decentralized way of filling in those gaps as they emerge, then we're going to get stuck in that place again. We cannot allow that to happen. And I think that's a truly Liberal Democrat vision.
Are elected mayors the answer to the question you're posing?
I personally don't think so, actually, because all that is it's another level between the voter and the decision. And the reason, and my observation of elected mayors is they can work very well. And we've got, Mayor in Bedford, for example, who does a fantastic job. But I've also seen elected mayors as an excuse for that being the one person that the government then talks to, leaving out large numbers of people who are elected who are much closer to the decisions. And as a Liberal, what I want to see is that the decisions are taken as close to the people they affect as possible. And when you start to cut out councillors from that communication that needs to happen between those communities and central government, you're creating an extra layer. So it will be horses for courses. And if there are Lib Dem parts of the country that are desperate for a mayor, I'm not going to stop them. But my instinct says, actually, that's not the answer. The answer is to empower local government itself and empower our councillors who are close to the ground and close to the communities that they serve.
George Osborne created the Northern Powerhouse. Theresa May was less enthusiastic about it, but we've seen with the current Conservative government, you've already alluded to it, that they want to level up the North. So you've got a sort of a competitor there. The Conservatives seem to be on the case in the North. How do you see that?
Well, let's see if they actually deliver. And I think there is going to be a lot of people in the North who are going to be watching this agenda very closely and actually broadly. Believe it or not, Jim, I'm going to say something that might shock you. I support the idea behind that agenda. I do think that there needs to be a redistribution of wealth across the country. But you do that by investing. And one of the reasons why the North tends to be starved of investment is because of the way central government decides what's a good investment. One in, one out. If you put £1 in, a road in Oxford versus a wind turbine farm in Hull, what is going to be the overall money that's going to come back into central government? And it's a very simplistic way of looking at investment. I think the government should change that. And I've been talking about putting well-being at the heart of the economy. And what that means is that when you are putting in investment, you're also thinking about wider impacts, positive impacts that it might have, for example, on unemployment, on mental health, on opportunities for young people. And when I was door knocking in the North, that's what people were saying, is that they felt that the opportunities just aren't there. That's why people are moving away. That's why young people feel that they maybe need to move to London in order to get that first foothold on that career ladder. Actually, we need to totally turn that on its head. And we need to start by recognizing that the way government does investment right now is biased against the North. And just by funneling some money through a system that's already broken might fix it for a short while, but actually the systemic issue is the way that government thinks about investment. So let's create something more like what they have in New Zealand. Jacinda Ardern has done this very successfully there. Change the way that we measure GDP, change the way that we see investment, make it much more about communities and also seeing infrastructure as human, not just bricks and mortar. And that would actually fundamentally shift the way that we would do investment. I think this is quite a radical and bold idea, actually. And I'm not hearing any other party talk about this right now. So there's an obvious space for us to be talking about doing things differently.
Talking about other parties, I don't think many of the other parties would have conducted such an honest and open but pretty brutal analysis of what went wrong in the 2019 general election, the Thornhill report. I mean, it says many things which we'll come to, but one of the main ones was that the party leadership has to be made to listen more to the members. Now, I know you're going to say, of course, I will listen to the members, but can you give a slightly more detailed answer to that rather than just sort of going through the motions here? I mean, do you have thoughts about some mechanism where Northern Liberal Democrats, whether they be councillors or party members who haven't got a constituency MP, haven't necessarily got a council they're in control of, how are they going to influence you and the top leadership and actually feel that their voice is being heard?
Absolutely. Well, Jim, actually, I think this is the core of what went wrong at the last election was that, that revoke policy after the fact, people said, oh, I always knew this wasn't going to work. And I was in those rooms where it was being discussed. And it's absolutely true to say that the diversity of voices in the party was not represented in that room at all. But also, there was a little bit of, unless you agreed with each other, then you were doing something wrong. And that's no way to lead. If you ask teams around me, I actually welcome challenge. I think my job as a leader, as a team builder as well, is to make sure that I have the full diversity of voices in the room when I'm making a difficult decision, because in the end, the buck stops with me and I will have to make decisions. But if you don't have that full picture of information, then how are you going to make sure that you understand all the different facets of it? And my approach has always been, if I've got a room full of people advising me and we're all agreeing all at the same time about the same thing, actually that's my fault, something's wrong. I want people to be challenging. I actually think that this Zoom and all of these digital technologies provide us with an amazing opportunity. And when I say I will listen, actually I would argue I already have. I've been starting to. In fact, I've met with 300 local parties. That's nearly 3/4 of local parties since the last election, hearing from them, their views, answering their questions, but also inviting a conversation. And it needs to be both ways, because unless we are hearing what's going on the ground from our campaigners, we aren't going to start getting this right. The other thing I'll say is, I think we should be able to hold our leader to account more frequently than just the 2 times that we meet for conferences. And I would want to set up much more events like actually Boris Johnson does on Facebook, but with the membership and actually with the wider electorate as well. I want to be a listening leader, and listening leaders don't do that to absolve themselves of having to take decisions. You take decisions, but by being a listening leader, what that means is that you are inviting other people's voices in to the room with you and actually bypassing a lot of that process that quite often gets in the way.
Because, I mean, in the North, there are a lot of campaigners who've got a lot of experience about how to win in difficult circumstances. But it's not just that. Sometimes the world is totally different from, with respect, Oxford and Abingdon. You know, I mean, for instance, you know, red hot house prices, that's not necessarily an issue in the North. In fact, in places like Burnley, you can't get rid of the houses. You know, the Northern Liberal Democrats will have a completely different perspective on things, and we want to feel that they're part of a party which could otherwise be seen as very London-centric.
Absolutely. And if we are going to be a party that is going to grow over the next 10 years, which is what I want to reverse this decline that we've seen over the last 10 years. We need to be a party that is very obviously a party of the entire country, including the regions and the nations. And one thing I am not is hubristic. I don't think too much of myself. I know that if I have a question, the best thing I can do is to go out and ask it and not assume straight away that I have the answer. And I am going to be drawing on all of that experience from our membership, all of those long-standing campaigners, but also all the new ones, that fresh crop of people who've joined us, particularly since the referendum. They are part of their communities, and they and I will be reversing this decline together.
You've already referred to the Thornhill report's reference to supporting revoke, but I mean there were other ones like even agreeing to having the general election in December 2019, depicting Joe certainly early on in the election campaign as the next Prime Minister, and these are described by the Thornhill report as either very risky or actually wrong. I mean, you broadly agree with that conclusion, do you?
So on the general election, I raised my concerns in that room. My instinct was, let's not give Boris Johnson what he wants. I think that's a pretty good instinct. And, you know, in hindsight, of course, it was one we probably should have followed. In the circumstances at the time, we were, of course, very concerned that Labour was also going to push through the withdrawal agreement without any chance to put it back to the people, which was, of course, our primary aim. So we were worried about not being able to deliver on stopping Brexit. But, you know, I think in hindsight, it's all very well to say, you know, would have done this and that differently. It's about how you're going to change the way you work moving forwards. And what the Thornhill Review also points out is that there has been, you know, a sclerotic party behind all of this for 10 years. We've been decreasing in the number of seats. The 2010 election, despite us going into government, actually was a decline in the number of seats. And that has meant a hollowing out of infrastructure in local parties, which has meant that ecosystem of organizers that used to exist isn't there. It means that we're not training our volunteers. If we were a business, we would not be spending as little as we do training our staff, our volunteers, as the Liberal Democrats do. And that's where we need to start. If we've got strong local parties who have a strong sense of what their communities want, and then an HQ that is dead set on living our values of decentralization, I think actually a lot of the campaigning needs to be decentralized as well. Then we are going to have a much more responsive campaigning front. And Lib Dems, there are no freebies. You know, we thought that under first past the post with 20-something%, we'd be able to go through the middle and somehow form a government, and it just sounded incredible. So when I talk about trust and credibility, actually, these are the two things that we need to keep front and center of our minds. I'm glad that we've been really honest with ourselves about it. The job of the next leader is to rebuild trust and credibility in the places where we can win. And I think it starts by being really honest about where we are, what we've learned, and how we're going to change.
Well, the criticism being that Lib Democrats have lost their campaigning edge. I mean, if the one thing that you've always been identified with was being able to campaign, so that's quite a serious matter. And I mean, let me just try and tempt you onto this. I mean, Ed Davey has been the deputy leader. He's presided over a lot of this drift that you refer to. Is that something that you want to point out to people, that he's got some responsibility for this?
I think, bluntly, all of us have a level of responsibility. And of course, the closer you are into the leadership, the more responsible you are. And as leader, I want to take partly full responsibility, although I will point out that the Thornhill Review does say that there is a three-legged stool that is broken between the leader, the CEO, and the president. And we also have to recognize the place of the leader in that triumvirate. But nevertheless, I mean, we all have our part to play. And I noticed it at the last election that this was just missing. There was a suite of target seat parliamentary candidates who had not had specific training. So I created a group just for them, because I had some of that training early on in my parliamentary career. As a candidate, there was a thing called the leadership program. It was meant to improve the lot of women and BME and LGBT candidates in the party. And I'm collecting tick boxes. So I ticked a lot of those and got on the program. But it was a wonderful program. And what it taught me was that actually you can learn how to be a brilliant campaigner. It's something that can be taught, and it is an art as well as a science. And so I created this group of these first-time target seat PPCs, and we met weekly, offering campaigning but also pastoral support for them, so that they could then carry on. And I'm hopeful that a lot of them will continue to stay in their seats, because we need to grow this talent in the party, and that's just simply not what's not happening.
Right, I'm going to come into the final major area of questions I want to ask you, and it refers to your political stance in this election. You've identified Corbynites, people who are already in the Labour Party disillusioned with the, shall we say, the move to the centre by Keir Starmer, as being potential areas of support for the Liberal Democrats. Really?
Well, Jim, what I actually said was people who had been inspired by Corbyn, very young. Actually, this was an interview in the context of how I want to win back the young vote, because when I was at university, it was cool to vote Lib Dem, and we did. And Charles Kennedy was able to sort of connect in a really human way, and he took a really strong stance on Iraq, and it really attracted me. And that was the first time I ever voted, and it was for him. And I made the point that unless the party is going to grow in its core vote strategy, if we're going to have an electorate that grows over time, then a lot of our ideas that are very different to the other two parties, that is about, you know, a bold, liberal, positive vision for the future that's green and fairer. Actually, I think that's something that young people can vote for. And so I was making the point that by us being bold and liberal, that we should be attracting those young voters. But let me make no two bones about it. I'm not about to take this party to the left. That is not the idea. I'm going to take our party bold and liberal.
You want to be more radical than Labour?
More radical liberal, exactly, absolutely. And in fact, if you look back at when the party used to win, these were phrases that Paddy Ashdown and Charles Kennedy used a lot. And I found it interesting, Jim, that when I talk about radicalism, people assumed it meant left. And that just says to me how badly the word liberalism is now misunderstood in this country. And it takes me right back to where we are at the beginning. If we're going to regain trust and credibility with the voters, we need to know who we are and we need to communicate who we are. And that's liberals.
But you do need to be careful of policies that might be regarded as a bit kooky. I mean, this business is about abolishing the Treasury and having a department for sustainability. Are you serious about that?
I think it's definitely something we need to look at. And the point about sustainability is that it encompasses growth. You know, we are a party of business. We have always championed business. It was one of the reasons why we wanted to stop Brexit, because if nothing, business was saying, please don't do this to the country. And so my view is that by talking about sustainability, that's not counterproductive in any way to talking about things that might be classically seen as centre-right, but it's making the point that if we are going to grow and we are going to invest, it should be done in a way that looks to the medium and the long term. So when you have a company that, for example, is using huge amounts of palm oil in its supply chain, and that is destroying the Amazon rainforest, and we are a country that cares deeply about the climate emergency, COVID-19 is frankly going to be a dress rehearsal compared to what we're going to face if we don't tackle this quickly. Having that idea embedded in every government department is the way that we're going to achieve that difference, rather than having it as an add-on, which is what we see now. And I sat on the Public Accounts Committee for 3 years. I saw this happening. The green stuff was always the stuff that came later. And the last point sorry.
It all sounds very exciting, but would you agree with this caricature of the campaign that, you know, Ed Davey is a fairly safe pair of hands. He has a lot of support within the establishment of the party, and you sort of would know what you would get with Ed. With you, it's sort of maybe exciting and so on, but it's a bit risky.
I would say, Jim, the bigger risk is to stay as we are. And I would point people to where we are in the polls. And I ask them to think again, can they deal with one more election where they wake up with that feeling of, oh no, not again. We do have to change things up, but I'm not a risk because I know what I'm doing. I came from politics, from a solid background, maths and physics teacher. That's not a risky profession. I'm not a risky person, but I do know how to communicate, and I do know how to connect with people, and I do know how to listen, and I do know how to navigate change. And these are all the things that we now have to do as a party. So I would ask people to come with me on this journey as we move forward together, because that is now what we need to do. We cannot continue as we are.
Two final very quick questions. Would you like to see a pledge to rejoin the European Union in the 2024 Liberal Democrat Manifesto?
I would love that, and you know, my heart is with rejoin, and I want to get there as quickly as possible. I do also think we need to be quite pragmatic in that that's not where the country is right now. So what we need to do first, well, first of all, battle no deal, which is, I think, still very much on the table. Through that process, show people what they could have had versus what they're being given. Grow the public support for staying as close to the EU as possible. And then when that moment is right, when we've made the case and that's beginning to take hold, and I think it will, Jim, I do think that at some point in the next 10, 15 years, there will be a growing movement of saying that was a mistake. But to put it on the front of a manifesto now, unless that's happened by that point, I think that would be damaging for the party, because we would have lost trust with the electorate, and that's what we need to win back.
Finally, it's around the world, not just in Britain, it's a difficult time for Liberals or Liberal Democrats. Nationalism's on the rise, populism's on the rise. Polly Mackenzie, an aide to Nick Clegg, said recently that really you should concentrate on having great ideas and trying to influence things, but this pretense that you are going to be anywhere near power in any conceivable time frame is unrealistic. What do you say to that?
Well, we have to start delivering for people now. And I think to build back credibility, we do need to be really clear that a vote for a Liberal Democrat means, open bracket, you know, and if it's about foreign policy, it's about standing up for social justice, it's about collaborating with other countries, it's about changing the world, and we need to change that world for people now. But we are going to build credibility not by saying what we would do in some fictitious government in 5, 10, 15 years time. Actually, we build credibility by doing stuff on the ground for people. So every councillor who fixes a pothole. Boy, do we love talking about potholes, but that's because it matters, because it helps to build credibility. I'm the only Lib Dem MP in this period of coronavirus who has changed government policy. I started the campaign, the public campaign for the coronavirus compensation scheme. And that grew and grew across the House. I worked with backbench Tories, with Labour, with Greens. I teamed up with the Daily Express newspaper, not a newspaper well known for backing Lib Dem ideas. I have to say, I nearly fell off my chair when I got the phone call, but I was delighted. And then a few weeks later, it was announced that grieving families will get 60 grand that they didn't have before. That's, from the position I am in now, delivering for people in this country. And if I can do that from this position, imagine what I could do with the platform of the leadership.
Layla Moran, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jim.
To work the spin room.
The spin room.
The spin room.
What do people think so far?
Back to the spin room.
That he's really thinking through the issues.
Back to the spin room.
That we're expecting many more fireworks.
Hello. So welcome to the spin room after our interviews with Jim Hancock, Layla Moran and Ed Davey. I've got here Neil Fawcett, who is Layla Moran's campaigns chief, and Ben Rathe, who's Ed Davey's head of communications, and they're going to talk us through what they thought of those interviews. So welcome.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. So I think firstly, I mean, you're obviously both here to talk about how wonderful your candidates are, but to start with, you know, this is a contest between friends. We're all Liberal Democrats. So perhaps you could start by telling us what you thought that the other candidate did well. So Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Layla mentioned it in that interview as well, but I've worked with Layla in the past, and I like her a lot on a personal level, and I think the way she is totally open about who she is and the challenges she's faced in the past. You know, I'm someone who myself has struggled with mental health issues. So having someone who is completely open and willing to talk about those things and seek to be in a position of power is I think a really great thing.
Fantastic, thank you. How about you, Neil?
Yeah, I've known Ed since target seat training weekends in the run up to the '97 election, and we've had many an enjoyable evening in a conference bar or a training weekend venue over the years. And I mean, credit to him. He knows how to fight a campaign. He knows that it takes a lot of work over a long period of time, and he did really well to win the seat in the first place, and then he did really well to win it back. So you know, nobody can claim Ed isn't a pretty strong campaigner.
Fantastic, thank you. So, I mean, I think campaigning is really where I'd like to start. I mean, Jim asked them both about the 2019 election and their roles in that. And as far as I could tell, both of them sort of were present but not involved. You know, they were in the room, they were making objections, but, you know, weren't listened to. But, you know, doesn't that suggest that they just, you know, in a parliamentary party of 20, especially if you're the deputy leader, but in any case, in a parliamentary party of 20, isn't it a little bit of a warning sign if you can't get yourself listened to?
I think I'd say, sorry, if I can.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think there's a difference between being able to get yourself listened to and being able to change a decision that's already in train. And I think for me, the important thing to come out of 2019 for us as a party is what you learn from it and how do we do better in the future. And having talked to Layla a lot about that since the election, I think what she does understand, which is again ties in with what I've seen of her as a candidate here in the constituency over the last few years, is that she does take time to sit back, to think, to analyse, to listen to people and work out how to move forward. And I think what she has done is learn from that if in the party we work on the basis that major strategic decisions are only made in the parliamentary party, which by definition is a pretty unrepresentative group of people, because they're people who, in this case, won seats in the 2019 general election. They tend to represent fairly similar seats demographically. Then we're not going to get the best decisions. And from what she said to me since the election, I think she gets that. And I think that is a really important thing for the party moving forward.
No, fair enough. I mean, how about you, Ben? Do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd agree with Neil actually about learning lessons. I think the thing I would say is that, you know, people may not know I was Joe Swinton's press secretary, so I was in a lot of those rooms as well. And I'd say two things. One is that those decisions, I think Neil's encapsulation of it, which is the same encapsulation I think that's in the Thornhill report, a lot of those decisions were not able to be influenced at that point. That wasn't the point of influence. So I wouldn't necessarily use the influence in the room as necessarily the measure. But what I would say is that I was in those rooms and I saw the sort of who objected, who didn't, how they did it, how they approached it, and then what they went and did subsequently. And actually, one of the things that I was really inspired by Ed was his willingness to be an absolute critical friend in private, but then his commitment and his loyalty to go out and fight the decision in public, even if he disagreed with it in private. I think Neil's very right about lessons as well, about the lessons that we learn, and that's why I think the Thornhill review is really crucial in all of this, because it doesn't just focus on the 2019 election. It focuses on the problems that pre-exist that have existed in the party. You know, experienced campaigners like yourselves will both know a lot of the systemic issues, and I think it was a fantastic review. I agree almost entirely with it, and I think it's actually really good that Dorothy actually thinks Ed is the most credible candidate to deliver it, and that's why she's backing him.
I mean, I think, Neil, am I right in thinking that you contributed to the Thornhill report as well? I mean, did you sort of have any sort of thoughts on how it kind of came across and sort of how Layla would put it into practice?
To an extent, I mean, it was commissioned by the Federal Board, which I'm a member of. I certainly gave very strong feedback to Dorothy, who, I've known Dorothy since I was delivering focuses for her when she was first elected as a councillor, which is too many years ago to mention. I think it's a really good report. We've decided at the board to implement it and not to quibble about bits and pieces we might have slight doubts about, because it's absolutely clear to me that we do have to change the party fundamentally, and particularly get back to a party that is much more bottom up, much more based around campaigning at every level. There's been a bit of a sort of split between, I think, the Westminster bubble, as you might call it, and most people campaigning around the whole country, but particularly, I'm sure that's felt particularly in the northern regions. So for me, it's in the right direction, and we shouldn't quibble about the detail. What I do know, again, based on my experience of Layla, we had to do that after we lost the seat in 2010 in Oxford West and Abingdon. Layla came in at a point when the local party, if you will remember it, because you were in Oxford at the time. The local party was pretty broken after 2010, and then those disastrous elections in 2011 in particular. And we rebuilt, and a lot of people were involved in that, but Layla led that from the front. And that is what she does. She builds teams, and that leads to success.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I was in Oxford at the time, and I did have a couple of my most bizarre ever Liberal Democrat experiences at that time, including having to negotiate to the right to deliver focus leaflets, which I think might explain the narrow loss in the 2010 general election. But no, congratulations to all of you really for turning that around. I mean, I think the sort of need for fundamental reform is such an important point. And one of the answers I did think that was quite striking that Ed gave was around this kind of question of the party establishment, where he said, well, we're an anti-establishment party, so we don't have one, which, I mean, is that really credible? Surely sort of any large organization will have an establishment, and that's something that you kind of constantly have to be alert for and that you constantly have to challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be clear about I think the point that Ed was actually making, which I think was more to do with us as being an anti-establishment party. Of course, we have establishment structures. We have a federal board, as Neil will know, that has, I think, 43 people on it. I've worked in the city, I've worked in charities. I've never come across a board of that size. And one of the things that the Thornhill Review says is that we should look at the size of some of our committees and some of our boards. So, of course, we have establishment structures. But what I would say two things about the point about establishment, right, is one, Ed is right, and I think we should be clear what he means when he says we're an anti-establishment party. And the second thing is that when he talks about establishment, it's because I think sometimes that word is thrown around as if it is damaging in some way to one person or another. And you hear talk of the establishment candidate and things like that. But let's break down what that actually means, right? Are we saying that someone is the establishment candidate because they're backed by more of the MPs than the other candidate, that they're backed by more of the former MEPs than the other candidate, they're backed by more current council leaders? I mean, if we're really saying that Daisy Cooper and Munira Wilson, who were elected in 2019, are the establishment, then okay. But I mean, I think they probably have some quite strong objections to that. So I think we need to be careful when we frame it as establishment and not, because what we're actually talking about is a lot of people who have lots of experience of winning in the party and have won elections consistently in the last couple of years who are backing Ed. And I think I don't see that as a bad thing if people who have won elections are backing one candidate.
But surely part of the problem is that there are a lot of people who've also spent a lot of years not winning elections and contributing to campaigns that led to the Liberal Democrats as a whole not winning elections. And, you know, I think it is an important question of, you know, would Ed, if he were elected leader, really be able to challenge the people that had, you know, endorsed him so strongly in order to help him get to that position?
Well, I mean, I think every leader has to at some point challenge people who help them get there, and I don't think any leader takes that position with a view that they therefore cannot stand up against those people in the future. I think leadership is about being able to do that, and I've seen Ed do that up close and personal. When he was deputy leader, he was never afraid to stand up to people if they needed standing up to. But I think the as I said, the danger of painting it as establishment bad, change good, is that you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I mean, lots of people who, you know, fought and didn't win elections are also backing Ed. You know, you've got people like Cameron Hussein in Leeds who's backing Ed. You know, Hannah Kitching is backing Ed and didn't win her seat. You know, so I think the slight sort of the idea that we try and paint this as establishment versus not is, I think, ultimately unhelpful internally in the party. Because I mean, Laura, you were right when you kicked this off. You said that we are one party, we are one family, and I think running a contest where one person is painted as establishment as if that is a bad thing, and that word is used in a negative context, actually isn't helpful going forward. Because if the result goes the way that Neil wants and Layla wins, all of those people who have been sort of labelled the establishment, Layla still has to lead those people as well. So I don't think it's a sensible thing to get into having an establishment versus anti-establishment contest, because I think you're just talking about people who've won elections and hold high positions in the party and people who might not.
So actually that does tie to sort of the next question, which was one for Neil, which is, you know, we have seen that Ed has received many more endorsements from, you know, party grandees, let's call them, you know, senior people, particularly in the Lords, for example, as well as more of the MPs. You know, would Layla be able to take them with her in the changes that we need to see if she were to win?
I mean, my experience of Layla is that she is pretty good at taking people with her. I'd say my experience of this campaign, as with actually most of the Dem leadership campaigns, is that most people are saying, actually, we've got two very good candidates, and they're choosing between the two. And I think tying in with that last question, for me, it's not about establishment or not establishment. You know, even I've been accused of being part of the party establishment. It's about.
But you are on the federal board, so.
The very thought, Neil. The very thought.
Yeah, indeed. I think I've reclaimed my anti-establishment credentials, which is nice. It's more about what kind of change do you want to see? Is that the right direction for the party, and can you deliver it? What I've seen of Layla is she is very collegiate. What she said in the interview there about liking to have a team of people around her who challenge is definitely true. She's built teams of people who have different opinions from herself, and not least, you know, I mean, I'm her sort of most senior campaigner, I suppose, and we are pretty different from pretty different backgrounds. And I know she places a big value on that. So I think she has the skill and the ability to take people with her. Frankly, I think whichever of them win, that will be the case.
But I mean, if she is sort of so collegiate and so able to bring people with her, why has she not been able to bring more of the parliamentary party? And in that, I include the Lords as well as the Commons, with her in the endorsement stakes.
Well, she's got a lot of endorsements as well, from top to bottom of the party. I think what's more important is why, what people say when they endorse people, what their reasoning is, whether, and for members, is that a reasoning that they agree, that they agree with? So I'm not going to drop lots of names, but for example, Lynn Featherstone put out a very strong endorsement of Layla this week. Lynn obviously was a coalition government minister and speaks from that perspective. So there's quite a range there. I would say counting up endorsements, which I haven't, is not necessarily the most useful metric to measure an election by.
Fair enough. I mean, I'd like to move on and just ask a couple more questions about Layla specifically. I think there have been a lot of concerns through the contest about some of the personal issues that she's dealt with. And, when Jim raised them in the interview, she said that her strategy had been to be open about them. But I think a lot of people watching will have the concern that, well, actually, she referred to her sexuality and to her mental health and to her battle with obesity, but actually that wasn't, we know that that's not really what the question was about. The question was also about the incident where she was arrested on suspicion of domestic violence. And so, to say that her reaction to it was or her way of dealing with those issues was to be sort of open and proactive about them while not actually mentioning the kind of biggest concern that people will have. Is she really being open about it, or is she actually, or is there actually something there that hasn't fully come out yet that we really do need to be concerned about? And how would she deal with that if it does come up?
Well, on the question of openness, the reason we all know about it is because she put out a public statement setting out the basic facts, and I know that that's correct. I know that the authorities came to the conclusion that the charges wouldn't go ahead because there wasn't evidence to sustain them, and I think that does demonstrate a level of openness. She's been asked about that so far in this campaign, in the Times radio hustings last week. She's been asked by the Mail, by the Telegraph, and she's given her answer, and they've moved on. And in fact, if you listen back to the Times radio hustings, Matt, who was doing the interview there, moved on more quickly than Layla even wanted to. So I understand why you're asking the question. The evidence is that the answer she gives is satisfactory.
I mean, if I could just push you on it slightly, because I did listen to the Times interview. In fact, I listened to it while delivering leaflets, which may be the most Lib Dem activity ever. And I noticed that, in that she said that it had been in self-defense, whereas in when it first came out, she said that she felt threatened. She later said that it was defensive, and then most recently that it was self-defense. And of course, those are similar, but they're not exactly the same thing. So, is it clear which of those it was? And again, is it something where, we do have to worry that there's more to come out? That we would then need to worry about in a general election campaign. And I ask not because to judge, but because of course it is something that we would need to be prepared for.
So the answer to your second question is no. The answer to the first question is that if you do something because you're threatened, that is acting in self-defense. It's the same thing.
Okay. Thank you. So just moving on to kind of asking a couple of questions about Ed specifically. And I think there's a lot of discussion in this leadership contest about the role of the coalition and his role as a coalition minister. And in the interview, he said his sort of line was that it was unlikely to come up in 2024. But is that really credible? I mean, surely even if that's what we hope, and even if most of the voters have forgotten about it, surely the Labour Party won't let that happen, and it will be in the media just as it always has been.
So I think we should be clear about a couple of things, right? The coalition is going to come up whoever is the leader, right? It came up when Tim was the leader, and he didn't vote for most of it. It came up when Vince was leader and he was a cabinet minister who delivered our best set of local and European election results ever. It came up, you don't need to explain to me, it came up when Joe was leader, right? So the coalition comes up whoever the leader is, right? So let's not pretend that we solve the problem by electing one leader or another, right? It comes up either way. I think what Ed's point is, and where I think he is right, is that if you look at what happened in 2019, the reason why the coalition came up, and you touched on it there yourself, Labour won't let that happen. And I know that there are elements of the Labour Party who will forever hang the coalition round our neck. But, and this is really important, the difference between Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn is Keir Starmer is more bothered about being Prime Minister than Jeremy Corbyn was. So Jeremy Corbyn,
there are many more differences between Keir Starmer and Jeremy Corbyn, but I take your point.
So what Ed is talking about, and I think if you speak to other people whose political judgment that I trust, I know Tim Farron makes this point explicitly. If you're Jeremy Corbyn in 2024 and you need to beat the Conservatives in the 80 seats where we're second to the Conservatives, what is your interest in hammering the Liberal Democrats over and over and over and over again about something that happened 15 years ago? Keir Starmer's a smart guy, right? He wants to be Prime Minister. It will not be in his interest, in the same way it was in Jeremy Corbyn's interest, to stoke the same level of anger and of hate in 2024. And I think that's right, first of all. And I think that's the point that Ed was making. He's not pretending that people just aren't going to ask about coalition, but I think we should accept that people get asked about coalition regardless of whether they were in it or not.
So, I mean, do you agree with that, Neil? Do you think it'll just not come up because it's not in Keir's interest, or?
I agree that any Liberal Democrat leader will be asked about it. I think it'll be a lot easier for an MP who wasn't a coalition minister to move on from it more quickly, and I think most members would probably agree with that. But I think for me, the equally important point is that this isn't all just about beating the Tories in up to 80 seats at the next general election. Many of us, including actually us down in Oxford, are fighting local elections in May against Labour. And they're not going to shut up about the coalition anytime soon. And I'm pretty sure that's the case in Sheffield and Hull and Manchester and Leeds and Liverpool and everywhere else. We're fighting Labour in the north of England. So I do think it's a more important question than that. But it's also important that the answer is right. And that, I think, you've seen Layla answer that question. And it's about answering it with authenticity and with conviction. And when she says, for example, that under her leadership, the Liberal Democrats will not return to supporting austerity, it's believable. And I think that's the point. That's what's going to make a big difference.
So, I mean, just if Ed were to win and if he were to be asked about it, his answer in the interview was very much around the talking up the positives of the coalition, his achievements in green energy, which, are hugely valuable and have made an enormous difference to the UK as we live in now. And I think it's something that we should all be proud of. But at the same time, I mean, if he's in a sort of question time special and someone says to him, I lost my home because of the bedroom tax, he can't seriously come back and say, but we have lots of wind turbines now. Like, that would be seen as insulting. So, how is he going to respond to that?
Well, I mean, look, I think, first of all, we should be clear that that's not, I don't think anyone's suggesting that that's what any Liberal Democrat, let alone Ed would say. But I think you've got to be clear about what we as a party want to talk about, right? I sometimes worry that with the coalition stuff, it is akin to Keir Starmer going, well, Iraq was a terrible decision, wasn't it? And we sort of, we internally beat ourselves up.
I mean, so if I could just interrupt though, I mean, surely the difference is that, I mean, Keir Starmer was not an MP when the invasion of Iraq happened and didn't vote for it. So if somebody were to try and hang Iraq around Keir Starmer's neck, it would look ridiculous in a way that it wouldn't be the case if the candidate was, say, David Miliband.
No, because I don't actually think the person makes the difference, because it is a policy. It is something that is hung around the party's neck, right? The Labour Party will forever be attached to the Iraq war, for good or for bad. The Liberal Democrats will always forevermore be attached to the coalition. And obviously, as Neil says, for some people in the Labour Party, they will never forgive that, and that is always going to be a battle we're going to have to fight. But I think what Ed wants to talk about and is proud of talking about is his record in coalition. And I don't think there is a problem with wanting to stand up for the things that you are proud of, that you have achieved, whilst also accepting that no government gets everything right. I don't think you could point to a government on the planet that has, in their time in office, made every decision correctly. And I think that's just realistic. I think that is just an acceptance of the way the world is. And I think were Ed asked that question in the future, I think what he wants to talk about is his plans for the future. So his plan for a fairer, greener, more caring society, which is building on the incredible work that he did in coalition, that we should be incredibly proud of, as we should be proud of same-sex marriage, as we should be proud of the tax cuts for the lowest paid, as we should be proud of the people premium. So yeah, I don't think...
if I could just ask about the people premium specifically, because that was something that Ed mentioned in the interview that he'd delivered, but or developed. And, you know, I was... around in the party at the time, and I'm sure I remember Sarah Tether bringing the paper to conference, and then David Laws doing all of the work to get it into the manifesto. So isn't he sort of buffing his CV a little bit there?
No, certainly not. I think what we need to be clear on is that Ed is not the sort of person who would claim credit for somebody else's achievement. I've worked with him on a personal basis. He's not the sort of person. He's actually, one of the things I've learned from working with him on this campaign is that he's incredibly generous with his praise. When he talks about 1p on education, he talks about how Paddy was the driving force behind that. When he talks about the childcare policy we had at the last election, he talks about how Joe was the driver behind that. And trust me when I say the hours of meetings that I sat in with Joe and the policy team, working out the minute details of what Joe wanted in that policy, like that is, you know, entirely right that she gets the credit for that. Just to return to the people premium, because I want to answer the question directly. Ed was the education spokesperson, I believe, he was about education spokesperson for 12
2005
months.
and 2006.
2005. I didn't, thank you for probably with dates. The people premium had come from a pamphlet that Nick Clegg had written in 2002. Yeah. So, and Ed's never pretended otherwise. But Ed was the education spokesperson who worked it up for PPM and worked it up with the LDEA and took it to the parliamentary party. Then he was promoted to another role and he passed it on. But in terms of his role, in terms of taking it to the parliamentary party and talking about it and putting a paper forward, absolutely that's what he did. But I also don't think he's ever claimed that he would anything other than that. I think he uses he doesn't use the word delivered. I think he uses the word developed in the interview.
Right. I mean, would you agree with all of that, Neil? Because obviously you've been around the party a little bit longer than I have, even. So.
Look, I've signed a clean campaign pledge, so I'm not going to get into criticising what Ed might or might not have said or claimed or whatever. What I will say is that I think it is clear, having watched several of the hustings now, Layla puts a big emphasis on being part of a team. And you will hear her talking about we and us and the party. And when she talks about our victory in Oxford West and Abingdon, which for the record came as much as a surprise to me as it did to her on the night, to the extent that I'd even sent her a message saying, this is looking a bit tight. I don't think we've quite done it. And then she arrived just as the count turned round, which was a bit embarrassing for me. You know, she will always talk in terms of the team that we built up and doing it as a local party and developing as a local party. And again, in terms of how she operates as an MP, it is, you know, within the team, everyone has a voice, everything is discussed, everyone is listened to. And that, I think, is a strength. And it's the way our party works when it's at its best. And I think tied in with that is the emphasis and the understanding, picking up on an earlier point, that she puts on the importance of building the party at every level and in every part of the country, and that it is as important to win seats in local government and deliver for people as we are across the north, in my hometown of Redcar, where we're helping to run the council across to the bits of Cumbria, York and so on. It is important in its own right that we do that at a local level, as well as being part of rebuilding the party and winning more seats back at a Westminster level. But I think she's also right that, you know, we have to work together as a party to do that. And coming back to some of the discussion there's been around party structures and large federal boards and all the rest of it, what really matters is having a leader setting out a plan for the future that people get behind. that's when things happen. Structures can get in the way or they can help, but ultimately it's about setting out the vision and building a big team of people to follow. And for me, that's what I've seen Layla do in my patch, and I think she can do that for the party.
So just sticking on sort of Layla's plan for the future, I mean, Jim mentioned in the interview the sort of proposal, I think it was an article in politics.co.uk or similar about the sort of proposal to abolish the Treasury and replace it with the Ministry for Sustainability. And, you know, there are a few things like that, which just, you know, are those policies really likely to win over sort of soft conservative voters in sort of Cheadle, Harrogate or Cheltenham? I mean, you know, when Jim asked her about it, Layla was sort of talking about the importance of sustainability, which of course we all agree with, you know, its importance in relation to business, which again, of course we all agree with. But isn't it slightly throwing the baby out with the bathwater to kind of go as far as abolishing the Treasury? Can we not, and you know, is that not sort of giving us a little bit of a hostage to fortune in some of those kind of soft conservative doors that we really need to win in some of these marginal seats?
Well, I may lose a bet here, but I'm going to bet with you that when you were talking to people on the doorstep in the last election, nobody raised the question of the existence of the Treasury as an important.
Well, yes, but we also didn't have a manifesto that said we were going to abolish it. And I think if we'd had a manifesto saying we're going to abolish the Treasury, I'm pretty confident that somebody would have brought it up.
The bigger point, I think the point is that people vote for what they believe you can do to change their life or to improve their life, or in the near future, probably rescue an economy that is collapsing, rather than so much the mechanics of government. We could have a long debate about whether the Treasury is a good thing or a bad thing in terms of enabling a government to do those things. But what a leader is about is primarily around setting out the direction of our politics as a party. And tying that in with what Layla is talking about, it is about the economy, and in particular, it's about having a fair recovery. And that may mean some radical ideas like universal basic income, which both the contenders, I think, pretty much support. And back when Paddy came up with his citizens' income, as he called it, which Ed may have had a hand in, way back, that was probably seen as a pretty radical policy. But because Paddy was trusted by people and was seen as being authentic, and people had an idea about his politics and what he was trying to achieve for the country, it didn't make Paddy immediately look like some kind of, you know, radical lefty, because he'd already established himself as not being. And I think for me, that's the key to it. That's why Layla was able to win this, you know, the soft Tory voters in places like North Abingdon and Kidlington, some places you will have helped deliver leaflets in your time, as well as the progressive vote in North and West Oxford, because she's able to campaign in a way that is authentic and attractive to that broad base of people.
I mean, do you agree with that, Ben, or do you think we need to be a bit more cautious in our policy development?
I think the problem with the Liberal Democrats has never been a lack of policy, right? I think we can all three of us, plus everybody watching on this call, will agree that a lack of policy is not the problem. So what is the challenge, and the Thornhill Review sort of points at this, is having a coherent, consistent message. And I think one of the things that we've struggled with in recent elections is not having a sort of a concept of what you're getting when you vote Liberal Democrat. And Ed has that, right? He talks very clearly about a fairer, greener, more caring society. And what he means by that is a fairer society where you have universal basic income, which, as Neil said, both candidates are backing, where you have universal childcare to give, you know, what was described by the IFS when it was in our manifesto in the 2019 was nothing short of a new leg of the welfare state. Like, that is a huge fundamental change for social justice. And then when we talk about greener, because Neil is right, we're talking about an economic recovery that has to be fair, but it has to be green, because we have a career-defining opportunity to transform our economy in a green way, and that's something Ed has a tremendous record on. So that's why he's called for £150 billion of investment in the green economy, so he can do what he did in Hull, which is create thousands of green jobs, and what he hopefully can do in, you know, communities across the north, so that, you know, my birthplace of Cheadle in Stockport is a Lib Dem seat again, and Hazel Grove next door is a Lib Dem seat again, and those sorts of places. And then he talks about a more caring society, because Ed was a young carer to his mum. He now has a disabled
Yeah,
son.
okay. We have heard that. I mean, I know, and it is important and it is valuable, but we have.
No, but Laura, I am going to finish that actually, because actually it is really important to who Ed is as a person, and I don't think it's something actually we should just laugh off, because actually what it gives him is a connection with people, because there are 10 million carers in this country, right? That is 3 times more people than voted Liberal Democrat at the last election. So if we can elect someone who understands what that's like, has a plan to deliver a more caring future where we give them more money to carers, where we give them more legal protection, and we are known as the party of carers, which I think being led by someone who was a carer would be an important step to that. I think that opens a huge amount of opportunity for us to win, not just in the southeast and London, but in seats right across the country, including in the north as well. So I don't think we should dismiss it.
Well, no, to be fair, I wasn't dismissing Ed's experience. I was just saying that I think most of the people who are watching a spin room between campaign managers have probably heard it a few times, so we don't need to go into it in detail.
This is an important point.
If I could, just because we are getting towards our time being up, so if I could just give you, I've got one more question, but before we get to that, I mean, I think if I could just one question for both of you. You know, at the last election, we had some brilliant policies. And I think the free childcare is a really good example, because, you know, I have a young daughter and the amount that I pay for childcare is faintly horrifying. I worked out that I could send my daughter to the most expensive private school in Sheffield, and it would be cheaper than 4 days a week at the nursery place. So, you know, something like that would make a huge difference to families, but, you know, we just weren't able to get it across. So, you know, what is it that our party needs to do to ensure that we are able to communicate these? And if you could keep your answers quite brief, because we are kind of running out of time. And Ben, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, of course. It's message discipline. It is being consistent and using the airtime that you have to get those messages across. I think sometimes there's a tendency in the Liberal Democrats to sort of do media for media's sake, is I think of the phrase that Ed uses. And I think actually there is a danger of, you know, going for an approach where you try and get on the media to talk about everything, because that's how you get on the media, and you're willing to accept every little offer and every little bit of coverage for what you've got to be consistent, you've got to be disciplined, and you've got to focus on issues, like Ed did when he's asked the Prime Minister for weeks on end about an inquiry into COVID, and then on last Wednesday at Prime Minister's Questions, he finally got it through determination, through discipline, and through sticking to a core message. And that's genuine, real difference. And I think that's what we lack, and I think that's what Ed would give us, because it's something he's consistently demonstrated in this campaign and in previous ones as well.
Fair enough. And how about you, Neil? What do you think?
Well, I agree that it's partly about message discipline, but not in the sense of just repeating a slogan endlessly. Because if that was the secret of success, stronger economy, fairer society would have won us a load of seats in 2015, and it clearly didn't. It is about having a clear direction about what it is you're going to talk about and how you're going to connect that to people's lives. And Layla's chosen quality education, fairer economy, and dealing with the environmental emergency as 3 pillars of her campaign. And between them, they appeal to the broad mass of people who would support a broadly liberal ground government or party in this country. And that's quite deliberate. And it's built on what she's done, you know, and it is good to win points in Parliament. It's better to actually deliver something, as she's done with the coronavirus compensation scheme, from the position of being a backbench Liberal Democrat MP. So, and that's how we do things locally, you know. And one of the things she's very clear about in politics is that we have to be delivering for people now, and that actually is how you convince people of your message, because you show them what you're doing. And we've done that for years and years as Liberal Democrat local activists, where we win through. And there was a period when we did that very well nationally. So for me, that's you know, a really important element of this. Simple message, yes, but not just repeated for the sake of repeating it. Actually show people what the Liberal Democrats are about as you do it.
Fair enough. So, you know, final question. You know, we had some chat about this on the WhatsApp before we came in, but, you know, I'm sure everyone needs to know what your favourite biscuits are. Neil, over to you first.
As well as being mostly northern by genetics, I'm also a quarter Scottish. So I go for shortbread every time.
Fair enough. How about you, Ben?
Dark chocolate digestive.
Fair enough. Solid biscuit choice. Now I would go for a chocolate covered hobnob. So, you know, nice.
Equally valid, solid biscuit choice.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the campaign, and best of luck to both of you and your candidates.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.